There we go. Okay, why is this not working here? Let's see what we've got here. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm here. I'm just still trying to figure out why this. Where's my recording on the other channel? So give me a half a sec. I haven't gone anywhere. I'm just puzzled. Why it's not on? There we go. Okay, good. All right. Come on. Don't give me trouble. Okay. What is this crapola? Get this crapola off my phone, off my Facebook, off my everything. Ugh. Still here, folks. I'm just trying to get this stuff straightened out. Okay. God, everything is slow. Sunday night must be a busy night. Okay. Okay. We seem to be done. So thank you all for hanging in for me. Good evening. Good Sunday evening to you. And very nice to see you all. Excuse the running around, flipping. I still don't know exactly why I'm having so much trouble consistently getting the URLs so that I can put them on other things. So yes, I see several people here, some regulars and some folks who have not been regulars. So good to see you all. And Amy, Alexis, David, Greg, Marion, Jerry. I do feel like Miss Nancy from Romper Room. Barb. And Alexis, of course. Yes, Jim. Nancy. Did I say Greg already? Sherry. Hi, Sherry. Penny. Rick. Hello, buddy. And Jason and all you guys. So anyway, so good to see you. Just thought I would have a quick check-in. Again, sorry for the slightly delayed start. I'm trying to find things. I'm trying to juggle two different browsers. I'm easily confused. Let's never forget that because that's always a factor. And but I am now just about to do some reading and stuff. So here we are, deep into quarantine and deep into the pandemic. deep, deep, deep into the lies and evasions and idiocy of those who would like to pretend that this has been some kind of triumph or some kind of example of how government and the people should work together. Although some governments have been very good, especially some of our local state governments have done a good job. And I'm sure there are a zillion really hardworking people still in federal government. Certainly there are in the healthcare divisions and elsewhere. Unfortunately, the people at the top, not really doing their jobs, most of them. But that's another story. I'm not going to turn this into a political thing, much as I'm tempted to sometimes, because I'd rather concentrate on saying hi. Howdy, good to have you here and reading a story. So before I start that, I should just mention something in particular, which is that at the moment I am kind of transitioning between the obvious, easy to read short stories of mine and also the kind of lighter, funnier short stories of mine. And I'm now transferring over to some of the slightly more difficult stories in the sense of they're nasty or scary or upsetting. Or in tonight's case, also some of the longer stories. So tonight's story may run long. I'll try to read it all the way through. If it looks like it's going too long for me, I will probably have to chop it in half. So before I start, it's good to be here. It's good to be anywhere, to be quite honest about it, but it's especially good to be here sharing some time with all of you. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm actually beginning to look forward to this in a kind of a strange, disturbing way. I say strange and disturbing because on my end, it's just a picture of me talking, which, frankly, I could see anytime. It's not an uncommon state of affairs. For me to see pictures of me talking, for me to see pictures of me, which I really don't like seeing anyway. But I'm still enjoying the contact. I'm enjoying knowing that we're all in touch with each other. I enjoy looking over to the comments and seeing people going, oh, so-and-so, hi, hey, guy, how you doing? Hey, what's up, babe? And all these kinds of things. So anyway, so Marion says she's feeling under the weather, so I should probably start before it gets too drawn out. The story I'm going to read, I'm going to read at least the first part of, is actually kind of a favorite of mine. I've told you many people before the story of how I got to be friends with Michael Moorcock, the writer, the famous and very wonderful fantasy science fiction writer, Michael Moorcock, who created Elric and zillions of things, and Dorian Hawkmoon, and has also written brilliant mainstream, well, slightly odd for mainstream, but mainstream novels like Mother London, Gloriana is another favorite of mine. Anyway, so without going through that whole story again, which I'll tell again sometime for those who don't know what I'm talking about, I had a major revelation once, and Michael Moorcock was the subject of it, and it's the closest thing to a religious epiphany I've ever had. But I am not going to tell that story tonight. So what I'm indeed going to do, though, is I'm going to read the story that I wrote for an anthology, originally, I believe, was published by White Wolf Publishing Company, which was an anthology of Elric tales. And the only thing you need to know to enjoy the story, I guess, is it's two parts. I have a character. Well, I'll tell you that in a second. Elric is a classic fantasy trope. He is like the heavy metal fantasy superhero because he's miserable all the time. He's an albino. He is weak as a kitten without drugs and his magical soul sword, Stormbringer. Stormbringer actually is a living thing, and it devours souls. So when Elric kills somebody in battle, he takes their soul and gets strength from them. He can also keep himself alive with magical herbs and things like that because he's a sorcerer. And he comes from an ancient kingdom of not quite human people called the Melnibonéans. And he's got his gigantic black soul sword, and he's always miserable. He's had a crappy life. He accidentally killed his fiance, who I think was also his sister or something. I can't remember. Anyway, so he's classic. He's totally metal. He's just miserable and teenage, although he's not a teenager. There is a teenager in this story, and the teenager is named Pogo Cashman. The first name has to do with my name, because Tad, as a nickname, originally came when I was very small from the Pogo comics, the wonderful Pogo comic strip by Walt Kelly. So anyway, Pogo Cashman, who is this character's name, is kind of a stand-in for me. He's my younger, dumber alter ego from my teenage years. And he is, he's me, but not quite so well read, I guess, or something. And he is the other star of this story, along with Elric. And he's in the 1970s. Pogo lives in this story that takes place in the mid-1970s. But of course, Elric's part of the story takes place in Elric time in Elric world. But you'll see when we get to it. So anyway, without too much further ado, I am going to start the story, which is called Go Ask Elric. Up from the skies was rattling the windows. Sammy never played Hendrix at less than concert volume, no matter the hour, whether his parents were home or not. It was one of the things Pogo admired about him. Church, Sammy said, and took another hit on the bong. He puffed out his cheeks like a trumpet player, trying to hold in a cough. Yeah, man was God, Pogo nodded. Is God. He started to reach for the bong, but decided that too much dope would interfere with the rush when the acid hit. He'd hate it now, Sammy said. All this shit, Gerald Ford, hardly any acid, disco. He waved his hand in a loose-wristed gesture that summed up and dismissed the entire decade of the 70s to this halfway point. He'd be bummed. Fucking A. Pogo flopped back into the beanbag chair and contemplated the decor of Sammy's room. Roger Dean album covers, an M.C. Escher drawing with self-absorbing chameleons, and 3 different portraits of Jimi Hendrix were thumbtacked to the walls. Behind the pictures, those walls and the entire ceiling had been painted black and covered with whirlpools of white stars, the artistic end product of a weekend's speed-a-thon. The northwest corner stars were little more than blobs. Sunday afternoon, Pogo remembered, when they started to come down. It was a cool look, though, he thought, like floating in outer space, but with posters. As he watched, the stars shimmered slightly and the sable field behind them seemed to recede. Man, you feeling it? Sammy nodded. Getting buzzy. He leafed through his sideways stack of records, motor coordination already starting to short circuit. Dark Side of the Moon, sick of it. Surrealistic Pillow, oh, that's pretty trippy. Go ask Alice when she's 10 feet tall, he sang in the familiar and tuneless key of Sammy. He stared at the cover, then dropped it back and riffled further. How about Close to the Edge? Nah, more Hendrix. Electric Ladyland. Sammy tried to stand up, laughed, and crawled to the turntable. As the needle came down on the wrenching wah-wah of Voodoo Child, Pogo smiled a tiny smile. He needed the Hendrix right now. Jimmy was a friend in a way no one he had ever met in real life could be. Jimmy was, well, maybe not God exactly, but something. Something. He raised his eyes to the picture over Sammy's bed. The man, flanked by his experience. Black Jesus and 2 pasty thieves, all wearing halos of frizzy hair. Hendrix was smiling that little half smile, that "you can't judge me, brother, until you've been where I've been" smirk. And his eyes. Oh, Jimmy, he knew. Whoa, Sammy whispered from somewhere nearby. The room was getting dark, as though the sun was setting, but Pogo felt fairly sure it was still early afternoon, the summer twilight hours away. Yeah, he chuckled, though nothing was funny yet. Hendrix was watching him. Here comes the rush. And as the stars reached out for him, Laughing Sam's dice, Pogo thought. That one's all about stars and acid. Jimmy was hip to stars. He felt himself drifting like a rudderless boat in a sea of pack ice. Something was pulling at his mind, something he wanted to articulate and share. Sammy, check it out. Hendrix, man. The thought was elusive, but he knew it was important. Like the stars, man. He was saying that the stars are playing dice with the world, man, with the whole universe. And that when you take acid, the acid, it takes you out there where the dice are rolling. If Sammy replied, Pogo couldn't hear him. He couldn't see him either. The bright stars were burning before his eyes, and the interstitial blackness was empty beyond imagining. Pogo felt himself sliding forward, pulled as though by some slow gravity. This is some really fucking good shit, he thought. Then he plunged into a silent white bonfire. It was black. No, more than black. It was negative black, an absence of illumination so complete that even the memory of light was tainted. That movie about Jimmy's life, Pogo remembered, and was relieved to have at least his own thoughts for company. That guy said Hendrix was somewhere between like sleep and death, and he just chose a different trip. Just floated on out. Did that happen to me? Am I dead? He had a dim inner vision of himself, Pogo Cashman, lying on Sammy's floor. Would there be ambulance men? Sammy's parents? But Sammy wouldn't even come down for hours, so it might be hours until he noticed his friend was dead. In a strangely unworried way, Pogo hoped Sammy wouldn't find him during the teeth-grinding gray post-trip state. That would burn him out for a long time. Sammy was a good guy. Jesus, it was dark and silent and empty. So am I dead? Because if it's going to be like this for eternity, it's really boring. What if he'd just gone blind and deaf? That would be more in line with the horror stories about bad acid trips he'd heard. But that would be almost as fucked as being dead. No tunes, no movies. Well, at least he wouldn't have to go to school. Maybe he could learn to play pinball like in Tommy. As he seriously contemplated for the first time what entertainment the sport of pinball might provide to the hearing and vision impaired, the darkness was effaced by a dim smear of light. Coming down, he thought with some relief. Maybe I should have smoked some of that Colombian and cut the rush a little. This shit is pretty intense. The light bloomed, shimmered, then stabilized in a pattern of concentric rings. Several moments passed before he recognized what he was seeing. He stood in a long stone corridor like something out of a Dracula movie. Torches and brackets, moss-bearded walls, puddles of water throwing back ghost light from the torch flames. It was a long tunnel winding away out of his sight, some 100 yards ahead. What the fuck? Pogo looked down and was relieved to find his very own body still attached to him, unchanged since Sammy's room. Desert boots, patched Levi's, his black Lou Reed shirt covering the merest beginning of a hard-won beer gut. So, when you die, you get to keep your Lou Reed t-shirt. Mysterious and weird are the ways of God, or whatever they say. But the longer he stood on this spot, the more restless he felt. Something was calling him. No, not calling, but drawing him as a cool breeze might summon him to a window on a hot day, tickling at his thoughts. Something lay ahead of him down the corridor. Somebody there wanted him, was calling to him. Somebody... Hendrix! The thought was electrifying. I was thinking about Jimmy. It must be him, like his spirit or something. He's got a message for humankind, and I'll be his messenger. He hurried down the corridor, absently noting that, just as in the Dracula movies, his footfalls echoed unpleasantly, and small, furry things scuttled out of his path, vanishing into the shadows. If I'm going to be his messenger, he'll have to teach me how to play guitar like him, so I can make people listen. I'll take Jimmy's message all over the world, and I'll jam with Page and Clapton and all those guys. He entertained a vision of Jeff Beck shaking hair out of his eyes and saying, "Fucking hell, Pogo, you really make that act sing. Jimmy chose the right cat," as they stood basking in rapturous applause on the stage at Wembley, or one of those other big English places, both of them covered in manly jam sweat. Pete Townsend suddenly appeared beside them, his whippet face screwed up with anxiety. "You said you'd get high with me, Pogo, and tell me about Jimmy. You promised." Beck's angry proprietorial reply was interrupted by a squeak and crunch. Pogo looked down to discover he had trodden on one of the furry scuttlers. In the torchlight, he could see it wasn't a rat, but the bloody mess on his boot sole was not amenable to a more precise identification. Jeff and Pete and the imaginary rest did not return, but that scarcely mattered. Pogo's thoughts were quite taken up with what stood before him. A black iron door stood flush with the wall of the corridor, taller than Pogo and covered with bumpy designs. Writhing demons and monsters he saw when he leaned closer. It was quite solid beneath his hands and quite immovable. Yet the feeling of being needed pressed him even more strongly, and he had no doubt that its source lay on the other side. "Anybody in there?" he called, but even with his ear at the keyhole, he heard no reply. He stepped back, looking for a crowbar or other heavy instrument, or even better, a spare key, but except for the torches and the scuttlers, which seemed more numerous now, the corridor was empty. Pogo felt inexplicably certain that Jimi Hendrix himself stood on the far side with a message just for him from beyond the grave, and free guitar lessons thrown in. The situation was weird enough already that a simple locked door couldn't stop him, could it? When logic and proportion have fallen sloppy dead. The Go Ask Alice tune had been running through his head off and on since Sammy had sort of sung it, but now the words of the old airplane drug song seemed particularly appropriate. Down a hole like Alice in Wonderland, caught in a bad acid trip. What did Alice do? For a little girl who'd probably never heard of Owsley or Haight-Ashbury, Pogo had the dim idea the original book had been written a long time ago, like around World War I or II. She'd always seemed to get through all right. Of course, she'd had magic cookies and stuff, which made her shrink. Suddenly, the door was getting bigger. The keyhole was several feet above his head and climbing. At the same time, water was rising around his knees, and the walls were getting farther and farther away. Holy shit, I'm shrinking! Bitchin'! If he could stop the process at some point, that was. If not, it might become a bummer of major proportions. As the crack at the bottom of the door rose up past him, the black iron portal itself now loomed as large as the Chrysler building. Pogo waded through the puddle beneath it, making a face as the scummy water slashed around his chest. Once the broad expanse of door was passed, he floundered out of the bilge onto a spit of muddy dirt and thought very hard about growing. When it worked, he was almost as surprised as the first time. His surroundings drew down around him like a film run in reverse, the walls shrinking like a sweater sleeve washed in hot water. When the process slowed and then halted, Pogo ran his hands over himself to make sure everything had returned to its correct size. He briefly wondered if he could enlarge just selected parts of his body as well, which might help him finally get some chicks. And then he looked around. There was only one torch here, fighting hard against the dank air. The wide room was mostly sunk in shadows. A few clumps of muddy straw lay on the floor. Out of them, like Easter eggs and plastic grass nests, peeped skulls and other bits of human bone. Pogo could tell a bad scene when he saw one. "Woo," he said respectfully. "Torture chamber. Grim, man." As if in response, something rattled in the shadows at the far side of the chamber. Pogo squinted but could see nothing. He slid the torch out of the bracket and moved closer. The feeling of being summoned was stronger than before, although in no way unpleasant. His heart beat faster as he saw a shape against the wall. A human shape. Jimmy, the man himself, the electric gypsy. It must be. He had summoned Pogo Cashman across time and space and all kinds of other shit. He had the wrong color skin, for one thing. The man hanging in chains against the stone wall was white. Not just Caucasian, but without pigment, as white as Casper the Friendly Ghost. Even his long hair was as colorless as milk or new snow. He did wear a strange rock starish assortment of rags and tatters, but his eyes, staring from darkened sockets, were ruby red. It was not Hendrix at all, Pogo realized. It was Johnny Winter? The pale man blinked. Ariok, my lord, you have come at last. He didn't sound like Johnny Winter, Pogo reflected. The blues guitarist was from Texas, and this guy sounded more like Peter Cushing or one of those other guys in the old Hammer horror movies. But he wasn't speaking English either, which was the weirdest thing. Pogo could understand him perfectly well, but a part of his brain could hear words that not only weren't English, they didn't even sound human. Do not torment me with silence, my lord, the white-faced man cried. I am willing to strike a bargain for my freedom. I will happily give you the blood and souls of those who have prisoned me here, for a start. Pogo goggled, still confused by the dual language trick. Ariok! The pale man struggled helplessly against his chains, then slumped. Oh, I see you are in a playful mood. The length of time you took to respond and the bizarre shape you have assumed should have warned me. Please, Lord of the Seven Darks, I have abided by our bargain, even at such times as you have turned it against me. Free me now, or leave me to suffer if you please. Pogo began. I'm not whoever you think I am. I'm Pogo Cashman from California, and I'm pretty high. Does that make any sense? Change section. Elric was beginning to believe that this might not be Ariok after all. Even the Hell Duke's unpredictable humors did not usually extend this far. This strange, shabby creature must then be either some further trick by Elric's tormentors, or a soul come unmoored from its own sphere, which had drifted into this one, perhaps because of his magical summoning. Certainly the fact that Elric could understand the language the stranger called Pogo Kashman spoke, while knowing simultaneously that it was no human tongue he had ever encountered, showed that something was amiss. Whoever you are, whatever you are, do you come to torment oft-tormented Elric? Or if you are no enemy, can you free me? The young man eyed the heavy iron manacles on the albino's wrists and frowned. Well, I don't think so, man. Sorry. Bummer. The meaning was clear, though some of the terms were obscure. Then find something heavy enough to crush my skull and release me from this misery, breathed the Melnibonean. I am rapidly growing weaker, and since apparently I am unable to summon aid, I will be helpless at the hands of one who has not the right to touch a Dragon Emperor's shadow, much less toy with me for his amusement. And as Elric thought about Badishar Chan's gritting, gap-toothed face, a red wave of hatred rolled over him. He rocked in his manacles, hissing. Better I should leave him only my corpse. An empty victory for him, and there is little in this life I will miss. The stranger stared back at him, more than a bit alarmed. He brushed a none-too-clean hank of hair from his eyes. You want me to kill you? Is there anything else I could do for you instead? Make you a snack? Get you something to drink? He looked around as though expecting the priest king to have supplied his dungeon with springs of fresh water. The albino wondered again whether this idiot apparition might not be a further cruelty from his captor. But if it was, it smacked of a subtlety the Chon had not previously exhibited. He struggled to maintain his flagging patience. If you cannot free me, friend, then leave me to suffer in peace. Thrice cursed Badishar Chon has taken Stormbringer, and Without the strength it gives me, my own treacherous body will soon accomplish the executioner's work without assistance. Stormbringer, my dark twin, my pet demon, my sword. The strange youth nodded. Got it. Your sword. You know, this is pretty weird, this whole setup. Like a Tolkien calendar or something. Are there hobbits here too? Elric shook his head, surfeited with nonsense. Go now. One who has sat upon the dragon throne prefers to suffer in private. It would be a kindness. Would it? I don't know. Would it help if I got this sword for you? The albino's laugh was sharp and painful. Help? Perhaps. But the Chon would be unlikely to give it to you, and the 200 killers of his topaz guard might have something to say on the subject of your taking it. Hey, everything flows, man. Just try to stay cool. The youth turned and walked back toward the front of the cell. Elric's dimming sight could not follow him into the shadows there, but although the stranger had clearly left the cell, Elric did not hear the door open. Even in his pain and long simmering fury, he had a moment's pause. Still, whether the stranger was a demon, a hallucination, or truly some hapless traveler lured between the spheres by Elric's desperate summons, the Melnibonéan doubted he would see him again. Next section. Curiouser and curiouser. Who said that? Pogo grew back to his normal height on the far side of the door. This was certainly the strangest acid trip he had ever taken, and it wasn't getting any normaler as it progressed. Still, he had told the pale man he'd fetch his sword, and who knew how long it would be until the acid started to wear off. Better get on it. He chose a corridor direction from the somewhat limited menu and set off. The stone passageway wound along for quite a distance, featureless but for the occasional torch. Pogo was embarrassed by the meagerness of his own imagination. Sammy went on a spaceship that time when we did the 4-way window pane, with all those blue insects flying in and giant donut creatures and everything. Of course, he reads more science fiction than I do. All those guys with funny names like Moorcock and Phil Dick. Sounds like they should be writing stroke books instead. Still, if his imagination hadn't particularly extended itself in terms of dungeon decor, he was impressed by the relentless realness of the experience. The air was unquestionably dank, and what his desert boots were squelching through definitely looked, smelled, and sounded like the foulest of mud. And that Elric guy with his built-in mime makeup had been pretty convincing, too. The corridor opened at last into a stairwell, which alleviated the boredom somewhat. Pogo climbed for what seemed no little time. He was still terribly disappointed that it had not been Jimi Hendrix who had summoned him. He had been so certain. A few more steps brought him to a landing, which opened out in several directions, and for the first time he heard sounds other than his own crepe-soled footfalls. He picked one of the arched doorways at random. Within moments he found himself surrounded by people, rather a shocking amount of them. Perhaps he had undercredited his own powers of creativity, all bustling about, dressed like they were trying out for The Thief of Baghdad or some other Saturday morning movie of Pogo's youth. Shaven-headed, mustachioed men hurried past bearing rolled carpets on their shoulders, and small groups of women, veiled to a disappointing degree, whispered to each other as they walked close to the walls. In one large room that opened off the hallway, dozens of sweating, flour-covered people seemed to be cooking a fantastically large meal. The din was incredible. None of them seemed to pay much attention to Pogo. He was not invisible, no one bumped into him, and several actively avoided him. But nobody allowed themselves more than a swift glance before continuing briskly with whatever task consumed their attention. He forced a few to stop so he could ask them the whereabouts of a magic sword, but they gave him no reply, sliding away like cheerleaders from a drunken loser at a party. As Pogo walked on, the hallway widened and became more lavishly decorated. The walls painted with flowing patterns of blossoming trees and flying birds. He saw fewer and fewer people until, after he had walked what he estimated was about twice the distance from his house to Xavier Cugat High School, he found himself in a section of the vast palace, or whatever it was, that was empty, except for him and the whispering. He followed the rustling noise farther down the corridor, peeking into open rooms on either side. All were abandoned and deserted, though they looked as though they were in regular use. At last he found himself at the doorway of a large chamber that was inhabited. It was from here the whispering came. In the center of a huge, high-roofed room stood what looked like a stone altar, the kind of thing on which someone might sacrifice a very, very tiny virgin to some undersized gods. Ranged around this altar, mumbling and hissing amongst themselves, stood half a dozen bearded men in robes of dramatic colors and wild design, each garment different, as though the men were in some sort of fashion competition. They stood in a ragged circle, intently examining a black sword which lay atop the altar stone like a frozen snake. Several dozen grim-faced soldiers in gleaming armor studded with pale brown jewels stood facing out in a protective ring around the robed men, each with a long, nasty-looking spear in one hand and a curving, equally nasty-looking sword sheathed at his waist. "Those must be the guard guys Elric was talking about," Pogo reasoned. "And that sword those other dudes are looking at must be Stunbanger, or whatever it is." His good acid trip confidence began to pale a little. Surely, even if they couldn't really hurt him, it was only a hallucination after all, right? Getting whacked with all those sharp things could turn the trip into a real bummer and possibly even make him feel kind of queasy for a couple of days after he came down. After a moment's consideration and a single careful thought, he felt himself begin to shrink once more. It was strange walking along the groove between the tiles and seeing the edges stretch valley-like over his head. It was even stranger staring up between the legs of the colossal topaz guardsmen, each one now as tall as the pylons of a bridge. It'd be pretty cool to do this right underneath Diana Darwin and her jockette friends, if they were wearing skirts. He laughed, then froze in place, afraid that he might be heard and noticed. After a moment's reflection, though, had he ever heard a bug laughing? He hiked on. Climbing up onto the dais was difficult, but at his present size there were irregularities in the stone that offered good handholds. The robed and bearded men around the sword were talking, and just as with Elric, he could understand them perfectly, or at least their words, although their voices were thunderously loud and rumbled like the bass notes at a Deep Purple concert. Their meaning was a little less clear. "It is a coagulated form of etheric vapor. Were it not for the binding rituals, it would retransmogrify into vapor absolute and evaporate. If we could just try the splitting spell once more." "Your reasoning is as thin as a viper's skinny bottom, Dalwazar. Etheric vapor plays no part here. It is a perfectly ordinary sword that has been drawn through a multiversal nexus, and hence its individual monads have turned inside out, more or less." "You two, if you would ever look at something without trying to make it fit those hobby-horse ideas of yours, those addle-brained pseudo-certainties you cosset and fondle in your lonely beds as though they were catamites. Banishaw Chon needs answers. Bah! Never send a theoretical thaumaturge to do a practical thaumaturge's job." As Pogo was listening to this, albeit uncomprehendingly, and pondering how he could get to the sword itself, he was putting aside the "and then what" question for a little while, something large and dark moved over him, like a storm cloud. "And what is this? Look, Dalwazar, a homunculus. Now, tell me how your etheric vapor nonsense explains the breeding of homunculi by the study object. Ha! If there was ever a proof that this is a product of a multiversal nexus..." Pogo looked up in shock as he realized that the whatever they were talking about was him. As he wondered whether it was his desert boots, he had told his mom he wanted real hiking boots, but she had told him he wanted a pair of $60 Vibram-soled shoes just to stand around the parking lot. He could damn well get a job. A pair of tweezers the size of a lamppost closed on his shirt and jerked him into the air. He hung now before something so full of holes, so covered with hairs like burnt tree trunks that for a moment he thought he had been kidnapped by a public campground. Sorry, I missed that line. He hung now before something so full of holes, so covered with hairs like burnt tree trunks, that for a moment he thought he had been kidnapped by a public campground. Several more moments passed before he could make out what it was. A giant face. Quick, get the killing jar! The fumes from the yawning, snaggle-toothed cave were enough to make Pogo swear off onions for life. Ah, Dalwezar, you will cringe in embarrassment when this is published. You will shriek and writhe. Etheric vapor will become a term of academic scorn for centuries to come. Pig! Of course you want to put it in the killing jar. Were I allowed to boil it alive, you would see that this, too, is a pure distillation of the vapor. Give it to me. A grisly thing like a giant pink squid reached up and snatched at the tweezers. Pogo felt himself being whipped back and forth through the air as though on a malfunctioning carnival ride. The material of his t-shirt began to shred. Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, 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 he thought in panic. Small bad, big good. The robed and bearded men suddenly began to shrivel around him, as did the room itself, even the serried ranks of Topaz guards. Within moments, all half-dozen learned men had disappeared. Or rather, as Pogo realized after a bit, they were still around, but he was sitting on them. He could hear their dying cries from beneath the back pocket of his Levi's and feel their thrashing final moments against his posterior. It was pretty gross, but he couldn't get up since his head was now wedged against the tiled ceiling. The Topaz Guard, hardened combat veterans to a man, stared at the sudden appearance of a 45-foot-tall California teenager in a rock and roll animal shirt, then screamed and fled the great chamber. By the time the last spear had clattered to the floor, Pogo was alone. Something was giving him a distinctly painful sensation in his hindquarters. He reached around behind himself, shuddering as he scraped loose a wet unpleasantness in a robe, and tried to remove the pricking object. As soon as his fingers touched the black sword, he found himself normal-sized once more, the transition so painfully swift that for some minutes he could only sit, head spinning, among the unwholesome remnants of what had once been Badashar Chand's College of Thaumaturges. Next section. Elric looked up at the sound, a thin yet painful scraping. Something was happening in the darkness near the door of his cell. He felt so weak it was difficult to focus his eyes, let alone muster any interest. Hey, are you okay? The strange young man had appeared out of the darkness as mysteriously as he had vanished. Elric gave a hapless shrug which gently rattled his chains. I have been happier, he admitted. It's stuck halfway under. I'll fit. I just have to pull on it some more. It'll fit. I just have to pull on it some more. Too bad nobody around here ever heard of a kitty door. That would have been perfect. Having finished this obscure announcement, the young stranger turned and headed back toward the front of the cell. There was some kind of stain on the seat of his pants now. It looked like blood. After a further interlude of scraping, the apparition returned. Elric's eyes widened. This must be it, right? The youth held Stormbringer cradled in his arms. He had clearly never handled a sword. By my ancestors, how did you... Elric could feel the rune blades with nearness like a cool wind on his face. Long story. Look, could you take it? It feels kind of weird. No offense. Elric's white fingers strained at the hilt, which the stranger obligingly brought near. As his palm closed around it, he felt a tiny trickle of energy, but within moments even that ended. Elric still felt very feeble. There is something wrong. Perhaps it has been too long since the blade has taken a life. It does not strengthen me the way it should. He twisted his wrist. Even with the slight additional strength it had given him, he could not lift it upright. Oh, it is hungry for souls. The stranger, what had he called himself? Pogo Kashman? Squinted suspiciously. Like, we could take it to a James Brown concert or something, I guess, but hey, don't point it at me, okay? That thing's weirder than a mofo. The Melnibonean slumped. Of course, my friend. I would not harm you, especially when you have done me such an unexpected good. But without Stormbringer's power, I am still as prisoned as I was before. And if the Chon has been alerted to its theft, he will approach me very carefully. I will not be given an opportunity to blood it. He paused, staring at the black blade. But if it were hungry for soul energy, depleted, then I do not understand why it did not try to force me to kill you. Usually it is like an ill-bred mastiff, always lunging at my friends. Pogo Kashman shrugged. Shit happens. Frustration welled up in Elric. To think that the last scion of his proud people should come to this, slowly starving to death in a cell, prisoner of a low-level satrap, his blade in his hand and yet useless to him. Ah, Duke Arioch, he screamed suddenly. Fate has played a clever trick on me this time. Why have you not come to gloat? Your love of irony should draw you, like a tick to hot blood. Come, Arioch, come, my lord, and enjoy my plight. Come, Chaos Lord. And, as the echoes of Elric's voice settled into the damp walls and mired floor, Arioch came. The light of the torch seemed to bend. The cell darkened, but for one spot, where the straw glowed as if afire. In that place, the shadows became a buzzing cloud of flies, which drew into a tight spiral, then circled more closely still until they composed a moving tube of glinting, humming darkness. The tube widened, then unfolded, becoming a beautiful young man in a strange suit of red velvet. He wore a cylindrical hat with a wide brim, and his hair was nearly as pale as Elric's own. Arioch, you have come, after all. The Hell Duke eyed him with amusement. Ah, sweet Elric, I find you in yet another dreadful predicament. Backed against the wall, Pogo Kashman was staring goggle-eyed. I know you, he said. You're that guy in the Rolling Stones. But Sammy said you drowned in your swimming pool. He regarded him a moment longer. Nice tux. Arioch turned to survey the stranger, his look of benign indifference unchanged. He said, his musical voice as languorous as the song of a summer beehive. Your taste in companions is still inimitably your own, my little Melnibonean. Elric felt compelled to defend Pogo Kashman, obscure and alien though he might be. This man has done me a great service. He has returned Stormbringer to me. Ah, yes, Stormbringer, which was taken from you by ambush, yes? Arioch walked delicately through the muck of the cell floor as though trying to keep the hems of his flared scarlet pantaloons clean. Your rune blade was snatched from you by Badishar Chon, I believe the fellow's name is, and subjected to much experimenting by his pet wizards, and now it doesn't function properly. Is that it? He spoke with the solicitude of Elric's old torturer, Dr. Jest, sympathizing with a prisoner over some heinous outrage which Jest himself had perpetrated. Yes, it does not overcome my weakness. I cannot break free. No doubt that is because of the splitting spell and the chronophage. Elric frowned. I have never heard of either of these things. The first is very simple, primitive even. Arioch crossed his legs as a tailor might, and hovered a yard and a half above the cell floor. Across the cell, Pogo Kashman's face split in a wide, incredulous grin. You wielded more powerful magics yourself when you were but a princeling, sweet Elric, a child. Badishar Chon searched far and wide to fill his college of thaumaturges, but his is a rather backwater kingdom after all, and the candidates were of a somewhat low order. Still, the splitting spell they used in an effort to unlock Stormbringer's secrets was crudely effective. though in their ignorance they did not even recognize their success. They managed partially to unbind its energies. Just for a moment, of course, but in one of those delightful coincidences that are the bane of less flexible sorts than myself. It happened to be just the proper moment, and a part of your rune blade's essence was drawn away. Drawn away? By what? And what of this chronophage? Some demon or wizard who robbed Storebringer of its power? Ariok smiled and floated higher until he was far above Elric's head. A tube appeared in his hand, pulled out of some crack in reality, and the Chaos Lord brought its brass mouthpiece to his lips and inhaled. After a moment, he blew out a great ring of blue smoke, which drifted above his head and hung there. It would never do to tell you too much, pretty Elric, he said. It is antithetical to chaos to rob individuals of their initiative. Games, Duke Ariok, always games. Well, then I will find the Chon's wizards and discover what they have done with their ham-handed spells. Ariok grinned around the brass mouthpiece. You will not have to look far, I think. He inclined his head toward Pogo Kashman. Smoke wafted from his nostrils. Turn around, you. The stranger stared at Ariok, then slowly pivoted until the stain on his backside came into view. If you have any questions for the Chon's College of Thaumaturges, chuckled Ariok, you may ask them now. It was an accident, Pogo Kashman said quietly. Elric shook his head. I understand nothing. Ariok blew another smoke ring. You must find Stormbringer's stolen essence. It will lead you to the chronophage. That is enough to begin. Farewell, my tragic underling. Wait! The Melnibonean leaned forward. His chains clanked. I am still trapped here, too weak to escape, which will make your adventure all the more piquant. Ariok abruptly began to grow transparent, then disappeared. The last of the smoke rings followed him into oblivion a few seconds later. 1,000 curses! Elric howled at the empty air, then let his chin droop to his chest. Even anger sapped him. He could feel his remaining strength sifting away like sand through spread fingers. Betrayed once more. My family's bargain with chaos has again proved to be a dubious one. Wow, man, sorry. Pogo Kashman came forward and awkwardly patted the albino's shoulder. I'm not too clear on all this, but it sounds like a bummer. He paused for a moment, then dug in his pocket. Would these help any? Elric goggled at the ring of iron keys. What? Where? Pogo Kashman shrugged. One of those topless guards dropped them when they all ran away. Ran away? Long story, man. Like I told you. The youth began trying the keys in the thick iron lock on Elric's shackles. The third one clicked, then clicked again, and the shackles fell away. Elric was having trouble encompassing all that had happened to him. He stared at his unlikely savior and shook his head. I thank you, Pogo Kashman. If I can ever repay you, well, I just hope you get your sword fixed, or whatever that swimming pool guy was saying. Elric held Stormbringer before him. It was still his living blade, but its essence was quiet, as though it slept. He shook it experimentally, then turned to his companion. And somehow, I gather you have destroyed the College of Thaumaturges? Badishar Chan's wizards? The look of embarrassment returned. Didn't mean to. I kind of sat on them. Elric shook his head, but did not pursue the matter. Then I shall have to find some other method of seeking Stormbringer's lost essence. You seem to be full of hidden powers, my friend. Can you help me? I am far in your debt already. I don't think so, man. I mean, I'm not even sure how I got here in the first place. We just took some acid, Sammy and me, and I was thinking about... Well, anyway, I don't think so. Then I must try to solve the riddle. Secretly, Elric Secretly, Elric felt a little relieved. The ease with which this stranger had defeated the Chawn's wizards and handpicked guard, and then retrieved Stormbringer, made the Melnibonéan feel embarrassingly helpless. His sickly constitution had often placed him in such a position, but he did not hate it any the less for its familiarity. Now, even though his predicament was desperate, at least he would stand or fall by his own devices. He racked his mind for a spell that would allow him to trace Stormbringer's stolen essence. This process was made slightly more difficult. By his own light-headed weakness, and also by Pogo Kashman, who strolled up and down the length of the cell, whistling and humming, and occasionally singing some tuneless ballad about the wind crying Mary, his feet crunching through the rotted straw. Elric winced but persevered, and at last a wisp of memory rose from the depths. "Bring me the torch," he called. His new companion went and drew it from the bracket, then stood in obvious amazement as the albino pushed his long-fingered right hand into the flames. What? Silence! Elric hissed through clenched teeth. When he deemed a long enough moment had passed, he snatched his hand out again. The pain was dreadful, but it was necessary. Between his own feebleness and Stormbringer's strange torpor, Elric needed to strengthen the connection. He grasped the rune blade's hilt in his raw, agonized hand and closed his eyes, then felt for the restlessly slumbering core of Stormbringer. "In flame and blood our pact was sealed," he intoned in a tongue that had been ancient before Ymir was raised above the waves. He thought he could perceive a vague stirring in the internal darkness. "With death and soul the bargain's fed. Now lost to me is my dark friend, its secrets all concealed. In blood our pact was first annealed. With death and souls the bond was made. Let light now burn away the shade. Let all now be revealed. By all the ancient lore I wield, by all who wait at my command, by my heart's blood and my right hand, now let the breach be healed." When he had finished the incantation, he paused, listening for something soundless, looking for something that had no shape. In a further shadow, deeper than the blackness behind his eyelids, something was indeed stirring. He felt for it and sensed its incompleteness. Stormbringer itself was searching for what was lost, the questing something that was the remnant of the blade's essence uncoiled and began to draw away from him. He seized at it with his mind and could feel himself being pulled along. "Pogo Kashman!" he croaked, eyes still tightly shut. "Take my hand!" Something grasped his left hand, even as he felt himself being sucked down through his own thoughts, down a darkly pulsing rabbit hole, into nothingness. And that's where I'm going to end for tonight, since we're pretty close to halfway, and the next section is quite long, and it wouldn't be a surprise then if I skipped a little ways into it. So anyway, that is roughly the first half of Go Ask Elric, starring Pogo Kashman, who's actually showed up in at least a couple of other stories. He's a character that I particularly enjoy writing because, as I said, he's somebody from my era, my time, the kind of glorious stupidness of the mid-'70s. I wrote another story for another anthology, which catches up with him later in life, and then I think I started or maybe have actually finished, but never done anything with a third story about him as an adult. Which kind of, like the second story, is about him working in a shoe store to begin with, which is of course what I did when I was 18 and 19 years old, in the course of my many dreadful jobs that I had before I was able to make a living writing. And just for a brief moment of biography, I kind of knew when I got out of high school, unlike all my friends and the people in my family, that I didn't want to just go off to university, college, get a degree. I always knew I wanted to do something creative, and I wanted to give it a try first before I went off and got a degree if it didn't work out. So it actually didn't work out for many, many years. I wasn't able to become a full-time writer till I was about 30. But, and I did briefly go to University of California at Berkeley for a short time, and then dropped out for various reasons having to do with the rest of my life. Nothing to do with school. I just wasn't in the school headspace. And then just kept working bad jobs because I knew I never wanted to get on a career track somewhere, because those are much harder to get out of. You become dependent on the income and all that stuff. So I just did what I had to do to get by, worked a lot of crap jobs. Oh my God, did I ever. It's one of the questions I get asked a lot at book signings and things like that, or question and answers when I'm doing them. People say, "I hear you had a lot of jobs." I'll go, "Oh yeah, a lot of them, and almost all of them were horrible. A few were fun. I worked at Apple in the late '80s, and that was an interesting experience. I was talking about the sea monkeys that we raised, our sea monkey farm at Apple, and I had a couple of other decent jobs, but most of them were things like selling shoes, managing retail stores of various kinds. I worked at a savings and loan and became a assistant branch manager, and all kinds of things. And what it mainly made me do was be much more respectful of people who work 45, 50, 60 hours a week, doing things they're not crazy about doing because they need to make money for their family or whatever. And it also made me even more conscious that if I didn't do something for a living where I made things and created, and also in my case shared things with people, that I would probably be miserable. I can think of a few jobs that I might have qualified myself for that I wouldn't have been miserable with. I would have enjoyed being a teacher and a few other things. But I was just not cut out to sit behind a desk and, be that copier guy or whatever. So anyway, so that's the first part. We will read the next part Sunday. I'm also in the middle of reading a long story to the nighttime European crowd, but even though I'm aiming that reading time, which was this morning, Sunday morning at 2 a.m. my time, even though I'm aiming that at an overseas crowd, obviously you guys are all welcome to join me for those too, or you can watch them here on Facebook, and eventually I'll get them posted on YouTube or something like that once I figure out how to do it in the midst of all the other confusion that I have been swimming in lately in terms of things to do. So, anything else? Can't really think of anything at the moment, and I think I'm going to go maybe grab some dinner if they left me any pizza. Any delivery pizza? So I do want to tell you how much I appreciate seeing you out here, coming to hang out. I hope you're all being good to yourselves, first and foremost, and to the people who are sheltering in place with you, as maddening as they can sometimes be. We all know that feeling. We were having a long talk with one of our friends on Skype today about, that the craziness that is on us now that we've been doing this for a long time. It's not that don't blame yourself. If you're feeling kind of crazy, you can say, yeah, I'm fine. I'm not in trouble or in pain, and I'm just staying home like I'm supposed to, and I'm watching TV, and I'm reading, and I'm making cookies, and blah, blah, blah. But it's kind of a weird childlike sense of impotence. You don't really, it's like being home from school for a really long time when you're a kid, where you don't know how long it's going to last. A lot of people in science fiction and fantasy had that experience. They had asthma or mono or something that kept them bedridden for a long time. And it's one of the places a lot of them first began to create. So that is an alternative, something you can do, but don't blame yourself if you feel weird. It's a weird situation, and we don't have any specific end point on it. So, you are going to feel at times like you're floating in some kind of Doctor Strange netherworld between dimensions or something. Anyway, so don't lose heart. I will continue to hang out. I hope you will continue to hang out with me. And with that said, I want to wish you a happy Sunday, wherever in the world you are, relative to my Sunday evening, and to ask you to all hang in there and be good to yourselves, and to send love to you from me and mine, from our house to wherever you are. Be well, be good.